Rob Dean was just starting to settle into his new life, or more accurately his old one that had found him again despite his constant efforts to run away from it, when the phone in his home office began to ring. Very few people had that number. He had to be selective. Those people who were given the number knew his job as a hunter of the occult was legitimate, and that he was doing the world a great service by tracking down the many creatures that haunt human nightmares. He had another phone line, one he gave out to the public for those cases that would bring in money, where he was hired to hunt ghosts or a vampire that was almost always a figment of the imagination. In the world of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Twilight, Supernatural and Ghost Whisperer, Rob constantly received calls from people who suspected someone they knew was either possessed, being stalked by a vampire, or haunted by a loved one who had yet to cross over to the afterlife. Those bogus cases, however, paid for the hunts that were real, cases Rob often found himself via stories in newspapers or on the internet. The voice that came over the phone when he answered it was a familiar one, that of DCI Peterson, Rob's contact in the local police department. He had struck a deal with the detective so that whenever there was a case too strange for the police to put on their own books, Rob would take over and hopefully solve it before the public started to ask questions. "Hello, Rob." "What can I do for you, detective?" "Drop the detective stuff, Rob. Call me Dave. I think we're way beyond being formal, don't you?" "I suppose so. I take it you have a case for me?" "Looks like it. What is it this time? Another girl turned up naked in a cemetery thinking she's been sleeping with a vampire?" The line went quiet, broken moments later by DCI Peterson trying to conceal his laughter. "Again, I'm sorry about that," Peterson chuckled. "It's okay. You weren't to know she was just making the whole thing up, even if she did almost have me dig up a random corpse for no reason." "Yeah, but it was still a waste of your time. Time that could have been spent actually helping someone." "From what I hear, that's nothing compared to what you had to deal with last week. The girl who imagined that model was her boyfriend and filed a missing persons report, even though he lives in another country and she's never actually met him." "Ah, you read about that in the paper," Peterson sighed. "Sadly, yes I did," Rob replied with a chuckle. "Apparently he didn't reply to a Facebook friend request, so she thought he must have been kidnapped. Just what we have to deal with, I'm afraid. Plenty of wild goose chases before we get to the real thing." "Yeah. Speaking of which, what's the case?" "Oh, sorry. I received a call yesterday from a man who claims his daughter was given a ride home by a phantom." "A phantom?" Rob asked sarcastically. "That's what he said. Anyway, I sent one of my junior officers up to speak to the girl this afternoon. Apparently she was staying with her aunt and uncle near Harrogate when a young man from her father's building firm showed up at the door, saying he'd come to take her back to her parents and that it was urgent. The girl panicked and went with him, thinking her mum was ill or something, only when she got to her parents' house nothing was wrong. Then she turned to look for the boy, and he disappeared into thin air." "So a guy gave her a ride home and then disappeared? What's weird about that?" "The guy in question has been dead for 6 months." "Oh. That does sound more like my kind of thing. But if she knew the guy was dead, did alarm bells not start ringing as soon as she saw him?" "She says she didn't know. Her father found her getting a little too close to the boy for his own comfort and sent her off to live with her aunt to get her away from him. When the boy died, her parents didn't want to devastate the girl, so they didn't tell her. That, and the fact that he was dressed in the same clothes he died in, make her think it must have been his ghost. So now she's terrified, thinking she's been haunted, which would be where you come in," Peterson said, the smile on his face clear in his voice. "Well, it does sound like my kind of gig, but why was that reported to you in the first place? I mean, it's not exactly a case for the police." "I thought that, but when the father called me, he said there was no other way his daughter could have made it to the house in such a short time. They live in Sanitaire." "The hell is that? Some kind of mental institution?" "I thought that at first," Peterson laughed. "I did a quick internet search. It's a little town up in the Dales. It was founded after the French invaded England in 1066. It was originally called Cordon Sanitaire, which translated means quarantine or quarantine line, because during bouts of widespread illness and disease, those who were sick would be sent there to keep them away from the cities so people didn't catch whatever disease they had. Over the years, the cordon bit was dropped, but the name still relates to the town slightly because it's in the middle of the Yorkshire Dales, and it's pretty isolated, so it's actually kind of like living in quarantine even today." "Wow, thanks for the history lesson. I thought you'd be interested. You're usually a history buff." "I know I am. And it is interesting information, but I doubt it has anything to do with what happened to that girl. Anyway, if this town is up in the Dales, how come you have to deal with the case? Because the town isn't really big enough to have a police station of its own. There are a couple of officers living there, and a few community support staff, but for the big cases they have to put a call into the North Yorkshire Police Headquarters, and guess who just happens to be a detective who's free at the moment? Fair enough. So, what other details have you got for me? Right, well, Sanitaire is about 40 miles northwest of Harrogate. The aunt only left the Harrogate house at 9, half an hour before the dead guy turned up, and when she got back home, just before midnight, the girl's car was still on the driveway. The father then reports that the girl showed up at his house around 10:15. So somehow this girl travelled 40 miles in 40 minutes, along a route that normally takes about 90, and with no actual form of transport, because even catching the bus or train would take longer given the changeovers and stops you have to make. Not to mention the small winding roads leading to the town if you're driving. You can't go above about 25 miles an hour or you end up in a field. And the father thought this was police business. Why? He assumed the only way for it to happen was either for some stranger to have picked his daughter up and given her a lift, in which case I'm not sure what we could have done with no information about any possible suspect, or his actual suggestion was that maybe the boy wasn't really dead. He thought he faked his own death? Rob asked, amused. Yeah, but I know he didn't. I remember the boy he was talking about. He was hit by a car after a football match, and I was working with West Yorkshire Police to figure out whether or not it was an accident. And was it? Rob asked, intrigued. Honestly, I don't think it was, Peterson said, followed by a pause. You think he was murdered? You know how football fans can get. Leeds United had just beat Millwall 3-1 in the Cup, knocking them out, and the guy in question was wearing a Leeds kit. He was probably drinking, celebrating, maybe rubbing it in the Millwall fans' faces, and one of them just snapped, hit him with their car and drove off. No witnesses, no actual evidence, so it was ruled as accidental death, even though it was clearly a hit and run. The parents protested, of course. It's a shame that everyone who watches CSI thinks everything is black and white, and there always has to be evidence to pinpoint someone to a crime. This is the real world, and sometimes there just aren't enough answers for all the questions. You're preaching to the choir, mate. Anyway, where's this girl now? Sanitaire still? Yeah. Are you okay going there, or do you want me to get her brought to you? It depends. Where's the guy buried? Sanitaire. Local graveyard. I need to go there then. If this is a ghost, I need to destroy the physical being to set the spirit free, since I don't have that Jennifer Love Hewitt mojo thing going on. I think I'll take the camper for this one. It's already getting late, and by the time I'm there it'll probably be too late to start digging someone up without the locals noticing. So you'll probably stay there for a couple of days? Well, as long as it takes, which hopefully won't be too long. And you'll have your mobile? Yeah, it's a satellite phone too, so you should be able to get hold of me wherever I am. Great. I'll send an officer over in a bit with a copy of the file so you have the addresses and all the details. Thanks again, Rob. I don't know what we'd do without you. Go mad, probably, Rob laughed. Peterson laughed in reply, said his goodbyes, and hung up. Half an hour later, a uniformed officer knocked on the door and, without saying a word, handed Rob the file before turning and heading back down the garden path. Whether he knew what was going on or not, Rob couldn't tell, but he was obviously uncomfortable handing out police files to someone who wasn't on the payroll. Rob chuckled, putting the file on top of a bag of clothes he had prepared. Inside were everyday street clothes, along with various costumes he often had to wear in order to carry out his research and interviews with regards to certain cases, without alarming the locals. DCI Peterson had even provided him with a police uniform, complete with numbered lapels that, if checked, would show up on a system as being real. All that was left for Rob to do was to pack the equipment needed to set the spirit free, though Rob had enough experience to know that not everything is what it seems when it comes to the supernatural world, and a creature can be completely different to what it was thought to be. In that case, he needed weapons. The roads were quiet, much to Rob's delight. He hadn't driven the camper for more than 3 years, and, while he was used to driving, it took time to readjust to being in control of such a large vehicle. At first he wondered whether or not it would even start after such a long period of standing stationary, but the engine roared into action with the first turn of the key. Strong gusts of wind crashed into the side of the long chassis as he drove along, trying to push it off the road, giving Rob a constant battle with the steering wheel if he wanted to travel in a straight line, or as straight a line as any of the roads would allow him to travel in. Earlier in the day, as he was loading his clothes and equipment he would need into the storage spaces in the motorhome, he was hit by a wave of nostalgia, remembering the good times he had inside it, travelling all over the UK hunting down any and all creatures he could find. His travels had taken him from London to Manchester, Nottingham to York, Glasgow to Belfast and Dublin. On all of those occasions, however, he was never alone, always having company. Now he was by himself, and feeling truly alone for the first time in months. The life he led was not one meant to be shared with others. He had learnt that the hard way. Hunters were solitary, rarely moving in groups. A normal, everyday life was a fantasy. From the moment you know about the supernatural world, it never lets you go. The creatures that usually remain hidden make themselves known, trying to track you down, more often than not with the goal of taking your life, their existence threatened by your knowledge of them. Loved ones are never safe. The majority of the preternatural life forms, having once been human themselves, know that the way to force any other human being to their breaking point is through their husbands, wives, parents, or children. They will stop at nothing to destroy your mind, body, and soul, and unless you can fight them off, 90% of the time, they succeed. Rob had been determined that he wouldn't live that life. He had wanted to experience everything a young man was supposed to, instead of being cooped up in a huge house by himself, with nothing to do but wait until his next almost robotic hunt began. When the opportunity to go to university presented itself, Rob saw it as the perfect way to escape to a new world, one where he didn't constantly have to look over his shoulder for fear of what might be lurking in the shadows, a world where the only knives he would deal with were in a kitchen for preparing meals, and not in his backpack, waiting to be driven into the next monster that crossed his path. University gave Rob a taste of the adolescent life he had missed out on. He made the friends he'd never had, met the girl of his dreams, and eventually got engaged to her, wanting to spend the rest of his life as part of a couple. Every cliché he had heard about the nuclear family and had cringed about before, with the 2.4 children, was what Rob now dreamed of. At the end of his 3-year course, Rob graduated with first-class honours in engineering. He moved out of the student accommodation into a flat with his fiancée, Candice, taking a job at a local company until something better came along. But things fell apart. The world he had been running from finally caught up with him. From a young age, Rob had been able to see things, to see creatures that other people couldn't see but who regularly approached him. When he told his parents, they blamed it on an overactive imagination, dismissing it as a game where Rob was imagining different friends in the absence of a sibling so as to not feel lonely. Most of the creatures that approached him seemed to merely scan him, taking in his details, assessing whether or not he was a threat. Seeing that he wasn't, they would leave him alone, never doing anything or even saying a word. The first creature that spoke to Rob looked like an ordinary man, except for the strange glowing aura that surrounded him. A dark green cloud enveloped the man's body, swirling around as if drawn by a gravitational pull. The man tried to entice Rob into following him, saying that he could show him how things really work in the world and how Rob could use his special gift to save the planet from an invasion. But Rob was terrified, wanting nothing to do with the strange man. His parents told him never to talk to strangers, never accept anything from them, and never, under any circumstances, follow them anywhere, no matter what they promised. Remembering that, Rob ran into the house where he hid beneath his bed, one of the only places he actually felt safe. By the time his father had discovered where he was and had gone outside to check that there was no one lurking in the bushes, the man had gone, and his parents once again put it down to him having a vivid imagination. Just weeks after his 12th birthday, there was a freak accident in the cellar of his family home that took the lives of both his parents. When Rob found their bodies, he didn't know what to do. He wanted to tell the police and those people around him, but he was afraid of going into foster care, hearing terrible things about it from a boy at school who was abused by his adopted father. He took it upon himself to give his parents the burial they deserved, working through the night to dig 2 graves side by side in the back garden. Managing to summon enough power to haul the bodies from the cellar using an old service hatch, Rob dropped them into the graves, covering them with soil he had removed from the holes earlier.